Azure has finally arrived in Forsaken, becoming the game's second trap-based killer. However, the community is heavily divided on whether he's overpowered or underpowered. After playing both as Azure and going up against them, I can honestly see why. From my experience on why people think he's too strong, first, his seeker bulbs are incredibly precise and can even secure kills on their own. Disarming his plants doesn't actually remove them, it only disables them for a short time. If you get caught by his traps, he has some of the most deadliest combo potential in the game. And why people think he's too weak is because you can simply walk to avoid triggering most of his plants, and his traps becomes very predictable once you know how to deal with them, that is by not using abilities or running near them. And lastly, he has almost no reliable way to locate survivors if everyone avoids his traps and plays patiently. So what do I think about Azure? Personally, I think he's on the weaker side. Let me explain. Azure is incredibly strong once he gets even a glimpse of your location. He can easily delete 90% of your HP if he catches you with that strangle and change it into a trapping plant, a seeker bulb, and a golem combo. Throughout the early and mid game, he feels incredibly threatening. You're constantly chipping away at server's health with seeker bulbs while locking down high traffic areas with your giant flowers. But then, the end game arrives and suddenly there are only 3, maybe even just 1 survivor left. Now you have a completely different problem. You have no idea where they are. Azure has almost no reliable way to track survivors who play patiently. His plans only reveal survivors who are running or using abilities nearby. So, anyone who has a brain can simply walks and stays cautious, can avoid giving away their position entirely. Once survivors understand that, Azure can spend a huge amount of time wandering the map with no leads, giving them plenty of opportunities to finish objectives or simply waste his times. Now, every survivor class can take advantage of this, whether you're playing support, survivalist, or sentinel. You can simply hide. Once you stop running and avoid using abilities near his plants, Azure has no choice but to wander around the map aimlessly while you quietly move from objective to objective. This gets even worse against survivors like 707 and Nu, whose abilities can make them invincible or completely undetectable. Those matchups makes Azure even easier to counter. Sure, his golem combo is terrifying when you get caught, but if you can just disappear after finishing an objective and deny him any information, what's the point of having that combo in the first place? And that's really the biggest flaw with Azure's designs. His entire kit revolves around punishing survivors once he knows where they are, but not actually finding them. He has incredible reward, but very little consistency. When his traps are working and survivors are constantly triggering them, he feels like an absolute monster. But the moment survivors adapt and start reacting, his plans instead of mindlessly sprinting everywhere, his pressure starts to disappear. Azure is what I like to call a mid-game menace. He's decent in the early game, reaches his peak in the mid-game, and then falls off hard in the end game. Early on, survivors are constantly rotating between objectives, choosing abilities, and making mistakes. That's exactly the environment Azure thrives because his plans are constantly gathering information. Mid-game is where he becomes the most dangerous. Survivors are usually injured, objectives are spread out, and the map is filled with his plans. One mistake can instantly turn into an strangle combo that deletes almost your entire health bar. This is where Azure feels oppressive, and honestly, I think this is the phase that makes so many players call him overpowered. But then the match just reaches its final stages. There are only 2, maybe just 1 survivor left. Objectives are almost complete, nobody has a reason to sprint across the map anymore, nobody needs to spam abilities to help teammates. Instead, survivors slow the game down, walk everywhere and play as safely as possible. And that's where Azure starts falling apart. His flowers stop giving him useful information because nobody is triggering them, his seeker bulbs become harder to capitalize on because survivors aren't entering predictable frauds anymore. Even his strongest combos becomes irrelevant if he can't start the chase in the first place. Last Man Standing is where his biggest weakness really shows. I'd honestly call it an 80 out of 20 matchup in the survivor's favor. If Glass Survivor break line of sight and get enough distance, you're in for the most frustrating experience you can have as an Azure player. You aren't making decisions anymore, you're guessing. Do you check corners? Do you search every building? Do you hope they accidentally trigger a plan? Because that's all Azure can really do. He has no reliable tracking ability, no built-in detection, and no way to force hidden survivors to reveal themselves. You're completely dependent on your opponent making a mistake, and good servers simply won't. Instead, they'll walk instead of run, avoid using abilities near your plants, and keep rotating whenever they hear your terror radius. They'll give you absolutely nothing to work with, forcing you to waste valuable time searching the entire map while they continue making progress. That's why, despite having one of the scariest combo potentials in Forsaken, I still think Azure is on the weaker side overall. His highs are incredibly high, but they're completely dependent on the servers giving him information. Against inexperienced players, he'll look unstoppable. Against experienced players who understand how his detection works, his biggest strength can be shut down surprisingly easily. And Azure is a perfect example of why a good killer isn't just about lethality, it's also about information. You can have the deadliest combo in the entire game, but if you can consistently find your target, that damage means very little. Information is what creates opportunities, and opportunities are what allow killers to actually use their strongest tools. That's exactly where Azure struggles. His lethality is absolutely there. Once he knows where you are, you're in serious danger. But the game doesn't end after one chase. As the match goes on and Sora becomes more cautious, his ability to get information starts falling apart. The fewer mistakes Sora make, the fewer opportunities Azure gets to show off the strongest part of his kit. A killer shouldn't have to rely on Sora's making bad decisions just to function. The best killers can force interactions or create information on their own. Azure, on the other hand, often has to wait and hope someone slips up. That's why I don't think he's a bad killer, but I do think he's an inconsistent one. When everything goes his way, he feels oppressive. When servers know how to play around his detection, he can feel completely powerless. And in a game where information wins matches, that's a pretty significant weakness. But hey, that's just my opinion on Azure. So, what do you think about Azure? Do you think he's overpowered, underpowered, or balanced? Tell me in the comments and your reason why. So, thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all on my next video. Goodbye!